The morning Edith Harper told Joel Bishop she was leaving, the sky above the Kansas plains had gone the color of a bruised deep purple at the edges, fading to a sickly yellow where the sun had not yet decided whether to rise or surrender entirely to the coming cold. She stood on the porch of the small clapboard house he had built himself, board by board, nail by nail, across 2 summers and 1 brutal winter, and she said the words plainly, without decoration, the way a woman says something she has rehearsed so many times it has stopped feeling like a confession and started feeling like a fact. She said she was leaving before the first frost. She said she had written to her sister in St. Louis. She said there was nothing left for her here, not in Harlow Creek, not in Kansas, not in the dust and the silence and the endless flat horizon that offered no promises and kept even fewer. Joel Bishop stood with his coffee in his hand, black, the way he always took it, and he looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that made you think of river water in late autumn, deep and still and not quite readable. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were calloused and certain in the way of men who had spent their lives making things grow from reluctant earth. He did not yell. He did not argue. He did not beg. He said nothing at all. He set his coffee cup down on the railing, walked off the porch and across the yard to the small shed where he kept his tools, and Edith stood watching him go with the peculiar, hollow feeling of a woman who has lit a fire expecting a reaction, and found that the room simply refused to burn. That was the 3rd week of October, in the year 1879. Edith Harper was 26 years old, and she had come to Harlow Creek, Kansas 2 years prior under circumstances that she did not always find easy to explain. She had not come as a mail-order bride, though people in town sometimes assumed that, the way small-town people assign narratives to strangers when strangers don't offer their own. She had come because her first husband, a man named Clarence Harper, had brought her west from Ohio with the promise of land and prosperity, and a life that would be large and wide and full. Clarence Harper had been a man of considerable charm and considerable bad judgment, and he had managed to lose their savings in a cattle venture gone wrong within 8 months of their arrival, and then he had developed a fever that the local doctor could not name and could not treat, and he had died in the spring of 1878, leaving Edith alone in a place where she knew almost no one and owned almost nothing. She had stayed because leaving cost money she didn't have. She had taken in laundry and mending work from families in town. She had accepted, with quiet dignity, the charity suppers that the Methodist Church organized and the small, discreet kindnesses of women who understood what it was to be a widow in a place that had no particular patience for vulnerability. Joel Bishop had come into her life, the way most things came into a person's life in those years on the frontier sideways, through practical necessity, without ceremony. His farm was 3 miles east of town, and he had hired Edith to help with the mending of his work clothes and the washing of the linens he never seemed to get around to washing himself. He had paid her fairly and promptly, and he had never once looked at her the way some of the men in Harlow Creek looked at a young widow, which was to say he had never looked at her like she was something available and uncomplicated. He had looked at her instead like she was interesting, like she was worth the trouble of attention. It had started slowly, the way things start slowly when both people involved have reasons to be careful. He had begun leaving books on the side table when she came to collect and return his linens, not as a gift, exactly, but left in the way you might leave a lamp lit in a window, available, without obligation. She had begun reading them, first reluctantly and then with real hunger, and returning them with opinions she hadn't asked herself if she was allowed to have. He had listened to every one of those opinions with the kind of full attention that is rarer and more valuable than most people understand. By Christmas of 1878, he had asked her to supper at the house. By February, she had agreed. By April, she had moved into the house, and by May they had been married in front of the Harlow Creek Methodist congregation, with the preacher's wife crying happy tears and Mrs. Alderman from the general store nodding approvingly, because Mrs. Alderman approved of any arrangement that resolved a situation that had previously been ambiguous. The marriage was good. Edith knew it was good. That was perhaps the most confusing part of all of it, the part she could not adequately explain even to herself. Joel was not a difficult man. He was not a cruel man or a cold man or a man who drank away their evenings and left her alone with the sound of wind against the windows. He was steady and warm and honest. He laughed with her, genuinely, with his whole face. He was a good farmer and a thoughtful neighbor, and he had once ridden 12 miles in a hailstorm to bring medicine to an elderly Osage man who lived alone on the creek bottom and had no family nearby to fetch it for him, a fact that had made Edith look at him for 3 days afterward with something she could not name but that sat warmly in her chest. But the land was relentless. That was the only word that fit. The Kansas plains were relentless in their winds and their silences, and their sky that was so enormous it sometimes felt like a pressure against the top of her head. She had grown up in Cincinnati, in a city with streets and noise and the particular comfort of being surrounded by human lives stacked close together. She had thought she could grow into this wide open place. She had tried, genuinely and with effort, to grow into it. 2 years in, she was not growing. She was contracting. She was becoming smaller and quieter in ways that frightened her, and she had looked at herself in the mirror one morning in late September and had not recognized something essential in her own eyes. And that was the morning she had written to her sister Ruth in St. Louis. And Ruth had written back within 2 weeks with an offer that was real and concrete and possible. Ruth's husband ran a printing business. There was work in St. Louis for a woman who could read and write and keep accounts, which Edith could. There was a city there, with its noise and its crowds and its comfortable human density. There was a life that Edith could picture herself inhabiting without that daily sense of being slowly erased by enormity. She had told Joel on a Tuesday morning, and he had said nothing, and she had watched him walk to his shed, and she had stood on the porch for a long time afterward, not entirely certain what she had expected, but certain that silence had not been it. That afternoon, she went to town to purchase some thread from Mrs. Alderman's store, and she told herself she would begin packing that weekend, that she would write to Ruth with a firmer date, that she would make the practical arrangements that a departure required. She was 26 years old and she had made up her mind, and the fact that making up her mind felt like swallowing something jagged was simply a thing she would have to endure. Mrs. Alderman wrapped her thread in brown paper and said, without looking up, "Cold coming early this year. Joel been in yet this week?" "He was in Monday," Edith said. "Good man," Mrs. Alderman said, still not looking up. "Planting late this year, I hear. Asked Henry Dawes for his opinion on winter varieties. Turnips, parsnips, that sort of thing. Kale maybe." She finally looked up. "Unusual. Most men are done with the ground by now." Edith said nothing. She paid for her thread and walked out into the thin October sunlight, and she told herself the information was irrelevant. When she came home that evening, Joel was in the north field with a lantern hung on a post and a shovel in his hands. The sun had set and the air had gone sharp with the particular bite of late October in Kansas, and he was working the ground in the growing dark like a man with a deadline. She stood at the fence and watched him for a moment. He did not look up. The turned earth smelled of minerals and cold, the way earth smells when it has decided to stop being generous for the year. She went inside and made supper. He came in at 8:30, stomped the mud from his boots at the door, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down at the table without explanation. She had kept his supper warm. He ate it with evident appreciation. They talked about small things, the Davenport family's new baby, whether the well might need to be relined before spring, a letter that had come from his brother in Colorado. He asked how her thread purchase had gone. She said fine. She did not ask about the north field. He did not offer. The days that followed had a particular quality that Edith could not categorize. Joel was not cold toward her. He was not punishing her with silence or withdrawal the way she had braced herself for, the way men in certain stories, and in certain actual marriages she had witnessed, made their displeasure felt through the deliberate removal of warmth. He was entirely himself. He was present and steady and occasionally funny. He fixed the hinge on the kitchen cabinet that had been sticking for weeks. He brought her a piece of maple candy from town that he knew she liked. He sat across from her in the evenings and read, and when he read something that made him smile or frown, he would look up and share it with her, because that was what they had always done. But every evening, with or without a lantern depending on the remaining light, he went to the north field. After 3 days she could not stand it any longer. It was an evening when the cold had settled early and the stars were beginning to emerge above the flat line of the horizon, and she pulled her shawl around her shoulders and walked out to the fence and stood there until he noticed her and came over, resting his forearms on the top rail. "What are you planting?" she asked. "Winter garden," he said. Waited for more. He offered none. "Joel," she said, and something in her voice must have asked the real question, the one underneath the practical one, because he looked at her with those river water eyes and something moved in them, something deep and not quite still. "Ground still workable," he said simply. "Be ashamed to waste it." "It's almost November," she said. "Kale comes up good in the cold," he said. "Parsnips sweeten after a frost, did you know that? The cold converts the starch to sugar. They're actually better after a hard freeze than before." He paused. "Turnips too, to some degree." She stared at him. "You're planting a garden for the winter," she said. "Yes," he said. "After I told you I'm leaving." He looked at her steadily. "You said before the first frost. Frost hasn't come yet." She did not know what to do with that. She stood there with the cold and the stars and the smell of turned earth, and she felt something she could not name working at the edges of her composure, and she turned around and walked back to the house because she did not trust herself to speak further on the subject. That night she lay awake for a long time on her side of the bed, listening to his quiet breathing, and she tried to reconstruct the logic of what he was doing. He had heard her say she was leaving. He had gone out and planted a winter garden. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not a speech or a confrontation or a declaration. It was just a man with a shovel and a seed packet going out and doing a quiet, stubborn, inexplicable thing in the dark. She didn't know if she should be furious or undone. By morning she had decided she was furious. She did not show it, because showing it would require acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would require explaining it. And she was not yet ready to explain anything she was feeling because she didn't entirely understand it herself. She made breakfast, they ate together. He thanked her for it and went out to his work. And she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and stared at the north field through the window and felt the furious, inarticulate thing turning in her chest like a hand inside a fist. She had expected him to ask her to stay. She had expected tears or argument or negotiation. She had half expected him to be quietly devastating about it, to say something precise and true that would make her feel guilty and torn. She had not expected him to just simply continue, to go on being exactly himself while simultaneously doing something entirely inexplicable that seemed to speak to her in a language she couldn't quite translate. On the 5th day after she had told him, she went into town and stopped in at the doctor's office. Not for herself, for old Emmett Briggs, who had the farm north of theirs and who had been struggling with a cough that wouldn't quit. She had promised Emmett's wife Clara she would ask the doctor to stop by. While she was waiting to speak to Dr. Leavitt, she encountered Tom Dillard, who was the postmaster and who made it his business to know everyone else's business, partly through professional exposure and partly through genuine temperament. Tom Dillard was a cheerful, round-faced man in his 40s who had been in Harlow Creek since before it was Harlow Creek. He greeted her with warmth and asked after Joel. "He's well," she said. "Heard he's putting in a late garden, that north field of his." Tom shook his head with the particular fond exasperation of someone commenting on an eccentric he admires. "Joel Bishop. Man's always doing something nobody else thinks to do. Remember when everybody said you couldn't grow wheat on that slope? Proved them all wrong inside of 2 seasons. Edith looked at him carefully. Do you know what he's planting? Told me himself when he was in for his seed order. Kale, turnips, parsnips, some variety of winter cabbage. And garlic, planting it for next summer. Garlic goes in the fall, you know. Tom tilted his head. Said he wanted something living in that ground through the cold months. Said a garden that only grows when the weather cooperates isn't much of a garden. Edith walked home 3 miles in the October wind, with that sentence working away at her like a splinter. A garden that only grows when the weather cooperates isn't much of a garden. She was not naive. She was not a romantic who had spent her life interpreting the world through sentiment and symbol. She was a practical woman who had buried a husband and reinvented herself in hard country, and had learned to be honest with herself about what things were and what they weren't. She knew that a man planting turnips was a man planting turnips, not necessarily a man making a metaphor. But she also knew Joel Bishop, and she knew that he was not a man who did things without intention, and she knew that he was aware she was watching the north field from the kitchen window every morning, and she suspected he knew what the sight of him out there working in the early cold was doing to her. And she suspected furthermore that he had calculated all of this very precisely, and that the precision of it was not manipulation, but rather the most honest form of expression available to a man who could not find adequate words for what he was trying to say. She was still, however, leaving before the first frost. She told herself this firmly and repeatedly over the following days, and she wrote a second letter to Ruth giving a more specific timeline, and she began quietly sorting through her belongings, deciding what she could take and what would need to be left. It was a small exercise that she found unexpectedly painful. The quilt she had made last winter, she would take that. The set of china plates they had been given as a wedding present, those should stay. They were too fragile for travel. The books on the side table, the ones Joel had started leaving there before they were married, she picked one up. It was a collection of essays by a man named Thoreau, and there was a page marked with a slip of paper that she had not put there. She opened to it. In the margin, in Joel's careful handwriting, he wrote the way he did everything. With deliberate care were 3 words. Still here. Read. She sat down on the settee with the book in her lap and her heart doing something uncomfortable and uncooperative in her chest. It rained for 2 days after that. A cold November rain that began on the 1st of the month and settled in with intent, turning the roads to mud and the sky to pewter. Joel couldn't work the north field in the rain, so he stayed in and repaired things. The chair that had wobbled since July, the latch on the storm cellar door, the window in the spare room that had been letting cold air in along the bottom sill. He did these repairs with quiet efficiency while Edith sewed, and sometimes one of them spoke, and sometimes they simply occupied the same warm room in the same comfortable silence that had always been one of the genuinely good things about them. On the second evening of rain, he made a pot of soup, a venison and potato soup with thyme from the kitchen garden. That was so good she ate 2 full bowls of it, and she caught herself looking at him over the rim of her second bowl with an expression that she hoped did not reveal as much as she feared it did. He was reading across the table. He looked up, caught her looking, and said, perfectly conversationally, "Clara Briggs taught me that soup." She said time makes the difference between a soup and just warm water with things in it. "She's right," Edith said. "She usually is," he said, and went back to his reading. Edith set her bowl down and made herself look out the rain-darkened window rather than at him, because looking at him was becoming dangerous in ways she had not anticipated when she had sat on the porch and said the words that were supposed to make the shape of her future clear. On the 3rd of November the rain stopped and the cold came in behind it, serious and settled, the kind of cold that means business. Joel was up before dawn and out in the north field, while Edith was still braiding her hair in the bedroom mirror. She could see him through the window, a figure in the gray pre-dawn, working methodically along the rows, and she did not know if he was planting the last of what he had planned or checking what had already been sown, and she was aware that not knowing was its own kind of torment. She went to town that morning for a reason she did not examine too closely, which was that she had a sudden compelling need to speak with Clara Briggs. Clara was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her early 50s who had come west from Tennessee as a young bride and had survived 3 droughts and a grasshopper plague and the deaths of 2 of her 4 children. And she had emerged from all of it with a kind of forged iron clarity about human nature that Edith had found herself increasingly drawn to. Clara was in her kitchen when Edith arrived, and Emmett was better. The doctor had come and prescribed a chest plaster and rest, and the cough was easing. And they sat with tea and Clara's dried apple cake, which was dense and sweet, and exactly what cold air calls for. "Joel's been at that north field," Clara said before Edith had said a word about any of it. Edith looked at her. "Word gets around," Clara said mildly. "Small town. Tom Dillard breathes and everybody knows about it within the hour." She cut another slice of cake. "What are you thinking about it?" "I told him I was leaving," Edith said. "Before the first frost. I have plans in St. Louis." Clara poured more tea. She did not say anything immediately, which was one of the things Edith appreciated about her, the absence of the reflexive rush to fill silence with opinion. "And he planted a garden," Clara said finally. "Yes. And said nothing about your plans. Nothing. He hasn't argued. He hasn't begged. He hasn't." She stopped. "He just goes out there every evening and works the ground, and then he comes in for supper and he's just himself." Clara looked at her with those sharp eyes. "What is it you wanted him to do, Edith?" "I wanted him to," she started and stopped again. What had she wanted? She had told herself she wanted to leave without a fuss, without drama, without guilt. She had told herself that Joel's silence was a relief, a sign of mutual respect and adult understanding. She had believed that for approximately 4 hours on the first day and not at all since. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Yes, you do," Clara said, not unkindly. "You wanted him to need you out loud. You wanted to know for certain that you matter to him as much as you suspect you do, but suspecting isn't enough, and a man who shows you instead of saying it can be the hardest kind to read." She picked up her teacup. "What does the garden tell you?" Edith was quiet for a moment. The fire in Clara's hearth popped and settled. "It tells me he intends for something to be here after I leave," she said slowly. "Something living, something that needs tending." "Or," Clara said, very gently, "it tells you that he intends for something to be here when you come back." The word landed in the warm kitchen air and stayed there. Edith rode home in the early afternoon with Clara's words sitting in her chest, next to the thing that had been sitting there since October, the thing she had been trying to name and mostly trying not to. The horse's hooves were muffled in the mud of the road, and the sky was the particular flat white of a November sky deciding whether to snow, and she drove the wagon with her hands steady on the reins and her mind anything but. She was 26 years old, and she had learned, through Clarence's death and through the hard years after it, that grief and loneliness had a way of convincing you that the present was permanent, that the feeling you were in was the whole shape of your life rather than just a season of it. She had been so afraid, in those dark months of her first widowhood, of making another choice that required someone else to sustain it, of giving her life's direction over to another person's capacity to keep their promises. But what had Joel Bishop done in all the time she had known him? He had been consistently, reliably, stubbornly himself. He had never promised her more than he could deliver. He had never performed a version of himself designed to persuade, and then let it fall away. The man she had eaten breakfast with this morning was the same man who had left books on the side table 2 years ago, the same man who had ridden 12 miles in a hailstorm for an old Osage man he barely knew, the same man who had built this house board by board with his calloused hands, the same man who was out in his north field in the November cold without a single word of reproach for her, planting things that would grow. She pulled into the yard and unhitched the horse and led her into the small barn, and she stood in the barn's dim warmth with the smell of hay and animal and leather around her, and she allowed herself, with extraordinary deliberateness, to ask herself the question she had been avoiding since October. Was she leaving because she wanted to leave, or was she leaving because she was afraid of wanting to stay? The first frost came on the 5th of November. She knew it before she opened her eyes because the quality of the silence outside was different, denser, held, the way the world sounds when it's been laid over with cold white. She lay still for a moment and listened to it, and she became aware that Joel was already up, already gone from the bed beside her. Through the window she could see the north field white and glittering under a sky that had gone the pale pure blue that follows a first frost, impossibly clear, achingly beautiful. She got up and put on her wrapper and went to the kitchen. The stove was already lit. The coffee pot was already on. There was a note on the kitchen table, written in Joel's careful hand on a torn scrap of paper. Gone to check the field. Coffee's ready. There are biscuits in the cloth. She stood and looked at the note for a long time. Then she went and found the biscuits wrapped in the cloth, warm still from the oven he had baked them before dawn, and she poured her coffee and she sat at the table and she ate and she looked out at the north field and she thought. He had said she was leaving before the first frost. The first frost had come. By her own stated terms, she should already be packing her trunk. She heard him come back an hour later, boot stomps on the porch, door opening. She had not moved from the table. He came in and hung his coat and looked at her sitting there with her empty coffee cup, and something in the way she was sitting must have communicated something to him, because he came to the table and sat down across from her without pouring his own coffee first. They looked at each other across the table. "The kale is fine," he said. "Kale doesn't mind. The parsnips are under mulch, they'll be all right. The turnip top's frosted, but the roots are good." He paused. "The garlic won't show till spring, but it's in there." Edith pressed her hands flat on the table. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. "When I told you, why didn't you argue or ask me to stay or—" "Because you are not a woman you argue into staying," he said. His voice was quiet and even, and she could hear the thing he was trying to say underneath the words he was actually using. "You've made your own way. You came out here with Clarence, and when Clarence was gone you kept going. You made your own decisions, and you made good ones, even when they were hard. I'm not going to stand in the path of that." He looked down at his hands on the table, then back up at her. "But I'm also not going to pretend this house is something I want to come home to without you in it." Edith felt her eyes sting, which she had not expected and did not welcome, being a woman who had trained herself against easy tears through years of practical necessity. "That is the most you have said to me about it," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm better with a shovel than with words as a general rule." The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile. "Joel," she said, and her voice came out softer than she intended, which told her something important. "You should go if you need to go," he said. "I mean that. I would not have you stay here and become something smaller than you are. I've watched that happen to women on this land, and it is a genuine thing and it matters." He held her gaze. "But I wanted you to know before you left that I was still here, and that whatever you left behind I was going to tend it." She understood then, with complete clarity, that the garden was not a manipulation and not a plea. It was a statement of fact. It was the most honest thing a man of his particular nature could say, because he had no other language for this, no other medium. He had said it in seeds and cold earth, and the stubborn insistence that something living could still take root even after the easy warmth was done. She stood up from the table. She walked around to his side. He tipped his head back to look at her, and she could see in those river water eyes the careful, braced quality of a man who has said everything he has and is now waiting, without expectation, for whatever comes. She put her hands on either side of his face, which she had never done with such deliberate intention, and she kissed him with her whole self, not gently, not cautiously, but with the full weight of everything she had spent 6 weeks trying to convince herself she was walking away from. He went very still for one moment, the way you go still when something you have hoped for arrives, and you are afraid to believe it. And then he was kissing her back with both hands on her waist, pulling her clothes, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and outside the frosted world was glittering blue-white in the morning sun. When they finally stopped, she stayed with her forehead resting against his, and the cold that had been living in her chest since October was gone, replaced by something that felt, with startling rightness, like thaw. "I'm not going to St. Louis," she said. "You don't have to decide that right now," he said, still steady, still careful for her. "I have decided," she said. "I decided an hour ago sitting at this table eating biscuits that you made at 5 in the morning." She pulled back enough to look at him properly. "You made me biscuits in the dark." "You like biscuits," he said, as if this were simply a fact of the world, which it was. She laughed, which surprised them both. It was a genuine laugh with warmth in it, and she saw his face open with it, lose the careful braced quality, become entirely itself without armor. "I like biscuits," she confirmed. "I like the North Field. I like the way you read. I like that you ride 12 miles in hailstorms for people who need you." She paused. "I like you, Joel Bishop. I love you. That is the problem that I made into a geography problem, and I am sorry for it." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was wholly unguarded, and she realized it was possibly the most open she had ever seen his face. "Don't be sorry," he said. "If you'd gone to St. Louis, I'd have kept the field going, and I'd have written you letters, and I'd have hoped." He took her hand, held it. "As long as you're here now." "I'm here," she said. "I'm here." They sat at the kitchen table together for a long time after that, talking, really talking, the way they hadn't managed in weeks, about the land and the loneliness, and the things Edith had been feeling and hadn't said, and the things Joel had been feeling and hadn't said, and the ways in which two people who are genuinely good for each other can still manage to nearly lose each other through the simple failure to speak plainly. Joel listened to everything she said about the vastness of the sky and the way it pressed against her, and the particular isolation of those winter months when the roads went bad and the world shrank to the size of a farmhouse. He didn't argue with any of it. He said, "I didn't know it felt that way. I should have asked," she said. "I should have told you without waiting until I was ready to leave." He said, "What would help? What would make it livable?" And they talked about that with a practical honesty that was new between them and felt, for all its novelty, entirely right. She said she wanted to go to town more. She said she wanted something useful to do with her mind, something beyond the household work, which she didn't mind but which was not sufficient on its own. She said she wanted to keep reading and to have opinions, and to have those opinions matter to someone. He said, "Your opinions always matter to me. I have been trying to show you that. I should have been saying it as well." She said she knew. She said she understood that men of his generation and his nature showed things rather than said them, and she did not fault him for it, but she said she needed more of the saying, and he nodded with the gravity of a man taking on a genuine commitment. He said he would try. He was not, in the weeks and months that followed, perfect at it. He sometimes lapsed back into the language of action, leaving things, fixing things, growing things, when words were called for. But when he lapsed, she had learned to ask him directly, to say, "I need you to say it to me." And he would look at her and collect himself and say the thing, sometimes haltingly but always truly, and that was enough. That was more than enough. November went on with its cold blue days and sharp nights, and the winter garden in the Northfield grew with the particular quiet resilience of cold-season plants, which do not grow fast but which grow deep. Edith found herself going out to look at it regularly, in the mornings while Joel was at the barn, walking the rows and examining what was happening close to the ground. The kale was dark green and robust, its leaves actually improved by the cold, the way Joel had said, the slight bitterness tempered to something rounder and more complex. The parsnips were invisible from above but present below the mulch, and she found she liked knowing that, liked the idea of things growing where you couldn't see them yet. She wrote to Ruth. The letter took her 3 attempts, because she was not certain how to explain what had happened without making herself sound, as if she had simply been weak or sentimental or persuaded out of a rational choice. by a man with a romantic gesture. She did not think any of those things were true, and she did not want Ruth to think them either. She finally wrote, "I was not wrong about what I needed. I was wrong about where I could get it. Joel and I have had necessary conversations that we should have had months ago, and I believe things can be different. I am staying. I hope you will understand, and I hope you will visit." Ruth's reply came in December, and it was short and somewhat exasperated and concluded with, "You were always more stubborn than sense, Edith Margaret Harper, and I suppose that is either your greatest fault or your greatest gift. I will visit in the spring. Keep warm." Edith read it at the kitchen table and showed it to Joel, who read it and said, "She calls you by your middle name. That means she's annoyed." "Ruth is always a little annoyed with me," Edith said. "It's how she shows affection." "I'll work on a guest room," he said, and went to fetch his measuring tape, and Edith sat with the letter and felt the particular full sensation of being loved by several people simultaneously in several different ways. December brought snow, and with the snow came the rhythms that Edith had previously found oppressive but now found, in some altered internal climate she did not fully understand, simply ordinary. The roads went difficult. The days grew short. They spent more time in the house together, and it was different from what it had been before, different because now they were talking genuinely, openly, at length, rather than conducting their closeness in silence and assumption. He told her about his childhood in Virginia, which he had left at 17 to come west, and about his father who had been a tobacco farmer with a strict and rather loveless manner, and about the brother in Colorado who was the only family member he had managed to maintain real warmth with. She told him things she had not told him before, about her parents in Cincinnati, her father who had been a bookkeeper and who had read to her every evening until she was old enough to read herself, her mother who had been practical and somewhat stern, but who had cried with real depth when Edith had left for the West with Clarence, as if she already knew something. She told him about Clarence. Not the comfortable short version, he was kind, he was unlucky, he got sick and died, but the real version, with all its complications. Clarence had been charming and not always honest with himself or with her, and the life he had promised had been partly genuine belief and partly wishful thinking. She had loved him, genuinely loved him, but the love had not been simple, and his death had been grief with mixed content, and she had never said that aloud to anyone. Joel listened without filling the silence with reassurance. When she finished, he said, "You've been carrying that for a long time." "There didn't seem to be anyone to put it down for," she said. "There is now," he said, "if you want." She did want. That was the thing she kept discovering, the ongoing surprise of her own wanting. She wanted this house and this man and this cold and difficult land that had begun, without her quite noticing, to feel less like an exile and more like a home. It happened gradually, the way the best conversions happen, not in a single revelation but in the accumulation of small moments, each one unremarkable on its own but collectively transforming. The morning she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked at the snow-covered north field and thought, without effort, without conscious intention, my field. The afternoon she found herself explaining to Clara Briggs the difference between parsnips and turnips with an enthusiasm she had not manufactured. The evening she and Joel walked out in the first real snow of December, their breath clouding in the cold, and she reached for his hand without thinking about it, and he took it without thinking about it, and they walked for 20 minutes in comfortable silence that was not lonely silence, not at all, but the silence of two people who have made enough peace with each other to share quiet without fear. Christmas that year was the best Christmas Edith had experienced since childhood. They had Clara and Emmett Briggs for dinner, and the Hendersons from the neighboring farm, and the Methodist preacher and his wife, and Tom Dillard, who had nowhere else to go because his sister in Missouri was snowed in and couldn't travel. Edith cooked a meal that took 2 days of preparation and emerged, in the warmth and noise of a full table, as something she was genuinely proud of. Roast pork and potatoes, winter greens from the garden kale, the dark, beautiful kale from the north field, dressed with pork fat and vinegar bread she had baked that morning, dried apple pie, Clara's recipe. When she brought the greens to the table and Joel saw where they had come from, he looked at her across the crowded table, and something passed between them that was private in its content and not private in its warmth. And Tom Dillard, who noticed everything, smiled into his plate. January was the month that tested her, because January on the Kansas plains was an endurance of another order. The cold was not the beautiful bracing November cold, but the grim, serious cold of deep winter, the kind that crept under doors and settled in your bones before noon. The wind came out of the north without mercy. There were 3 days in the second week when it was genuinely dangerous to be outside for extended periods, and they were largely confined to the house, and Edith discovered something about herself during those 3 days, which was that she was no longer confined in the sense she had been. She had books and she had conversation and she had a project. She had decided, following a conversation with Joel in December, that she was going to keep the farm's accounts properly, with a real ledger, organized the way her father had taught her, and she had set up the system and found it satisfying in the way that useful, competent work is always satisfying. Joel discovered during those 3 days that his wife, given sufficient cold and sufficient confinement, and a ledger that was going well, became charmingly opinionated about agricultural economics, and he found this, not to his surprise, because he had always found her mind one of the most attractive things about her wonderful. "You're undercharging for the grain," she told him on the second day, with the ledger open before her and her reading spectacles on her nose, a recent development that she thought made her look severe, and that he thought made her look academic and very handsome. "I've always charged that price," he said. "The Henderson farm is charging 8 cents more per bushel and getting it," she said. "I checked with Martha Henderson at the church social in November." She looked at him over the spectacles. "We are leaving money on the table, Joel, considerable money over the course of a year." He sat with this information for a moment. "You talked to Martha Henderson about grain prices at a church social." "I talked to Martha Henderson about a great many things," she said. "She is very informative." He smiled at her with his whole face, which he had begun doing more freely, and said, "Raise the price in spring." "I already calculated the projected difference," she said, and showed him the numbers. He looked at the numbers. "You are remarkable," he said. She looked at him over the spectacles. "I know," she said, and went back to the ledger, and he sat across from her in the January wind with an expression that was entirely content. By February, the winter garden was one of the more extraordinary things in Edith's daily experience. Under the snow, which she had not expected, much of it was surviving. The kale was extraordinary. It had taken the full weight of Kansas winter and was still producing, still dark green and deeply flavored, a small ongoing miracle of cold hardiness. The parsnips she dug from under their mulch on mild days, and they were everything Joel had said, sweet and dense and complex in a way that raw parsnips had never suggested. She made a parsnip soup in February that she and Joel agreed was possibly the best soup either of them had ever eaten. The garlic was invisible. It would be invisible until spring, but it was there. She thought about that sometimes. The garlic in the frozen ground doing its work invisibly, taking its time, emerging when it was ready. It felt like something worth knowing. In March, the world began to change. The thaw was not dramatic in Kansas. It was a gradual process, with false starts and retreats, warm days followed by hard frosts that kept you from becoming confident. But the light was different in March, longer and with a different quality, a warmth in the angle of it that February light lacks, and the earth began to smell different, to breathe differently. Joel started planning the spring planting, and he talked to Edith about it now in a way he hadn't before, not presenting decisions but genuinely consulting, drawing her into the thinking of the farm in the way that the Ledger project had opened up and made natural. She had opinions about the rotation of crops that she had arrived at through reading, and he took those opinions seriously and incorporated some of them, and explained why others wouldn't work for their specific land. And the conversations were excellent. Ruth arrived in April, as promised, on the stage from Abilene, in a traveling suit that was entirely inappropriate for a Kansas farmyard, and with a trunk that was twice the size of anything Edith had traveled with. Ruth Harper, she had kept her maiden name after her husband passed, which was a statement of character, was 41 years old, sharp as a tack, possessed of strong opinions expressed at volume, and within approximately 20 minutes of arrival she had assessed Joel Bishop with the thorough methodology of an older sister who has been somewhat skeptical of the entire situation. She had assessed him, Edith saw, through the medium of watching him with the horses. He was good with horses, unself-consciously good, patient and confident without force, and Ruth had stood at the paddock fence watching for 5 minutes before she turned to Edith and said, in a lower voice than was customary for her, "All right, I understand." "Do you?" Edith said. "He's real," Ruth said. "Some men are real and some men are performances. He's real." She pulled her inappropriate traveling suit jacket closer against the April wind. "Also, he has beautiful hands, but I did not say that." Edith laughed so hard she had to put her hand over her mouth, and Ruth watched her laughing with an expression that was still somewhat exasperated but was also deeply warm, and said, "You look well, Edith. You look more like yourself than you have in years." Ruth stayed for 2 weeks, and they were 2 weeks of considerable liveliness. Ruth and Joel regarded each other with the mutual wariness of two intelligent people who care about the same woman and are assessing each other's adequacy, and they spent the first several days in a sort of elaborate courtesy that had a quality of two cats circling a warm spot. Edith watched this with private amusement. The détente broke on the 4th day over a game of cards after supper, when Ruth, who was a very good card player, made a joke about farmers, and Joel, who had a dry and quick wit that most people never encountered because they weren't patient enough to wait for it, responded with something so precisely aimed and genuinely funny that Ruth burst out laughing and then looked at him with genuine reassessment and said, "Well, you're not boring at all." "I am occasionally boring," Joel said. "But mostly in January." After that they were fine. Better than fine, Ruth found in Joel a person who would listen to her talk about the printing business and the economy of St. Louis with genuine interest and intelligent questions, which was, she told Edith privately, rarer than it should be. And Joel found in Ruth a person who asked the sort of clear-eyed, direct questions about farming and frontier life that he answered with pleasure because they were real questions, not polite ones. On Ruth's last evening she and Edith sat on the porch together after supper, wrapped in blankets against the April chill, and Ruth said, "I'm glad you stayed." "Are you?" Edith said. "I was angry at first," Ruth said honestly. "You had a plan. I had arranged things. I was looking forward to having you close again." She looked out at the spring fields, the greening of the land in the last light. "But you are right here in the right way, I can see it, and that matters more than the rest of it." Edith squeezed her sister's hand. "Come back in the summer," she said. "Bring your friend Mrs. Conroy, bring whoever you like, there's room." "You'll regret that offer," Ruth said. "Probably," Edith agreed, and they sat together until the stars came out. Ruth left the next morning, and the house was quieter for her absence in the particular way houses are quiet after a person of considerable presence has departed. Joel made coffee and brought Edith's cup out to the porch where she was watching the road in the direction Ruth had gone, and he stood beside her and they drank their coffee in the early spring morning. "She approved of you," Edith said. "I know," he said with a quiet satisfaction that he did not bother to conceal. "She said you have beautiful hands," Edith said. He looked at his hands. "They're work hands," he said. "Yes," Edith said. "That's the point." He looked at her sidelong and she looked back, and it was one of those moments that people who love each other have with regularity and never entirely get used to. The moment where you look at each other and both know exactly what the other is thinking and both know that the other knows, and the knowing is its own kind of joy. The spring was good. The garlic came up in April, which Edith greeted with an enthusiasm that she was aware was somewhat disproportionate and did not care. It came up in neat rows, bright green against the turned soil, and she called out to Joel, who was across the yard, and he came and stood beside her and looked at it and said, "There it is. There it is," she said. It was, perhaps, an understated way to describe the emergence of something that had been growing in the cold dark all winter. But understatement was one of their languages, and it was an accurate one. The farm did well that summer. The crop rotation Edith had been reading about and arguing for through the winter showed real results, and when she went over the books in September, the numbers confirmed what the fields had suggested. They had had their best year. Not spectacularly so, not in the way of stories and sudden fortunes, but solidly, measurably, the way real good news comes in farming, steady and quantifiable and grounds for genuine optimism. She had also, in that summer, taken on something new. She had been asked by the Methodist Church to help organize a lending library, which had begun as a collection of donated books and had grown, through Edith's organizational talents and her letter-writing campaign to booksellers in Abilene and Wichita, into a real modest library with a real modest collection that was used by a real number of Harlow Creek's residents. It was not a grand undertaking by the standards of cities. By the standards of a small Kansas town in 1880 it was something, and Edith knew it was something, and the knowledge of it lived in her with a quiet brightness. It gave her the engagement with other minds she had needed. It gave her work that mattered. It gave her an anchor to the community that was hers, not an extension of Joel's, not a function of being someone's wife, but her own, grown from her own labor. She told Joel about all of it in the ongoing conversation of their evenings, and he listened as he had always listened, with full attention. And his pride in her was not the complicated pride of a man who feels reflected glory in his wife's accomplishments, but the simpler pride of a person who loves another person and is glad to see them flourish. In August of 1880, Edith realized she was expecting a child. She did not tell Joel immediately because she wanted to be certain, and she wanted to manage her own response to the certainty before she managed anyone else's. She sat with it for a week, this knowledge, examining it from various angles, and what she found was that the response was uncomplicated in its primary quality, which was happiness. Simple, fundamental, full happiness. She told him on a Sunday evening in late August. They were sitting on the porch after supper in the lingering warmth of summer's end, and she said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her. She said, "We're going to have a baby." The expression that came over his face was one she would keep for the rest of her life, take out and look at in her memory the way you look at something valuable. It was surprise first, and then something wide and full that had no single word for it, and then he reached for her hand and held it with both of his, and he said, "Edith." Just her name, just that. "Spring," she said. "The doctor thinks April." He pressed her hand to his mouth, and she felt him exhale against her fingers, long and slow, a man setting down something he'd been carrying carefully for a long time. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm entirely well," she said. "I'm happy." "Good," he said. He stopped. She waited. "That's the best thing I've heard since you said you weren't going to St. Louis." She laughed, and he laughed with her, and they sat on the porch in the August warmth with the world very good around them. She wrote to Ruth that week, and Ruth wrote back within 10 days with a letter that was 3 pages long and contained both maternal advice and a list of items she intended to send, including a particular kind of flannel that was apparently superior for infant clothing. The letter concluded, "I will be there by April. Do not argue with me about this." Edith did not argue. The fall of 1880 was different from the fall of 1879. Superficially, the calendar was the same. October with its cooling air and changing light, the preparations for winter. But the quality of it was entirely different for Edith because she was different, which is to say she was not afraid of it. The sky was still enormous and the land was still wide and the winter was still coming, but she no longer felt those facts as threats. She felt them as weather. She felt them as the natural course of things on this particular land, her land, the land that she had chosen and was choosing still. In October, as the first anniversary of her announcement approached, Joel came home from town with something in his hand, a paper packet of seeds. He set it on the kitchen table without comment and went to wash up. She picked it up. The label on the packet said, "Winter Rye Cover Crop Variety." She took it out to him where he was at the basin. "Cover crop," she said. "Protects the soil through winter," he said, drying his hands. "Holds the earth in place, keeps the nutrients in." She looked at the packet and then at him. "We're going to plant a bigger winter garden this year," he said. "I've got more varieties ordered. There's a new catalog from a seed company in Ohio, and the woman at the lending library," he said it with particular warmth, "managed to get several issues of an agricultural journal, and there was an article about cold season growing that had some interesting ideas." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been reading the agricultural journals at my library." "I have a library card," he said, with perfect seriousness. She stepped closer and put her hands on his chest, and he put his hands around her, careful of the new roundness of her, and she looked up at him and said, "1 year ago I stood on this porch and told you I was leaving." "I remember," he said. "And you went to your shed and got a shovel," she said. "I did," he said. "That was either the stupidest or the wisest thing you've ever done," she said. "I thought it was the only thing I could say," he said. In the language that made sense to me, he brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "I should have said more." "You said enough," she said. As it turned out, she paused. "You said it in parsnips." He pressed his mouth to the top of her head and she felt the laugh in his chest, low and warm. "Happy anniversary," he said against her hair. They planted the winter garden together that year, in the last mild days of October, Edith working the shorter rows while Joel did the heavier turning of the soil, and they talked while they worked with the ease of people for whom conversation has become as natural as breathing. They talked about the baby and what they hoped for, and what they would name it. They talked about the library and a woman named Agnes Cole, who had come in the week before, and had been so moved to find a copy of Jane Eyre that she had sat and read it in the corner for 2 hours, and then checked it out and come back the next day to talk about it. And Edith had spent the better part of a morning in the best conversation she'd had all month. Joel planted the garlic last in the dying light of the afternoon, pressing the cloves in at regular intervals with a deliberateness that Edith found, still, even now, remarkable in its care. "You could have someone else do that," she said. "I like doing it myself," he said. "I like knowing exactly where each one is." She watched his hands working the earth. "When this baby is old enough," she said, "I want to bring them out here and show them what you did, what you planted. I want them to understand about things that grow in winter." He looked up at her from where he was kneeling in the turned soil, and his face in the low autumn light was entirely itself, entirely present, entirely here. "I'd like that," he said. Henry Joel Bishop arrived in the world on the 14th of April, 1881, in a spring that had come early and warm, with the prairie grass already greening and the first wild plum blossoms showing white against the creek bank. Ruth was there, had been there for a week already, having arrived sensibly early with her trunk and her opinions, and her 3 pages of flannel infant clothing advice that turned out to be entirely correct. She held Edith's hand through the labor and said bracing, practical things in the tone that was specifically Ruth's, which managed to be both demanding and deeply loving. Joel waited in the kitchen with the quality of patience that is the other side of extreme anxiety, and when Dr. Leavitt came out and said the words that meant everything was all right, the color came back into his face in a visible wave. When Edith placed the baby in his arms for the first time, this boy, their boy, red-faced and furious at the indignity of arrival, with a remarkable amount of dark hair, Joel sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at this small person with an expression that was entirely beyond his capacity to manage or conceal. "Henry," he said, trying the name. "After my father," Edith said from the pillow, "if that's still agreeable." "It's very agreeable," he said, not looking up from the baby. Ruth, standing in the doorway with her arms folded and her eyes considerably brighter than she usually permitted, said, "His hands are large. He's going to be tall." "It's been 3 minutes," Edith said. "I know what I know," Ruth said. Henry Bishop was, as Ruth had suggested, tall for his age. He was also early to walk and late to talk, which Joel said was entirely characteristic of his own family history. And when he did begin to talk, he did so with great precision and some volume, which Edith said was possibly her family history. He had Joel's gray-green eyes and Edith's dark hair, and he had from very early on an interest in the garden that was evident and genuine. He was 14 months old when he first followed his father to the edge of the north field, and stood unsteadily in the turned earth with his hands out for balance, and his small face turned up to the sky. And Edith stood at the fence and watched them together with a feeling that was so large and so simple she could not have fit words around it if she'd tried. The library grew. By 1882, it occupied 2 rooms in the church building and had a proper catalog system, and Edith ran it 2 mornings and 1 afternoon per week, which was all her schedule permitted, but which was enough to make it real. She hired a young woman named Margaret Dale to help with the cataloging, and Margaret was 18 and bookish and ferociously intelligent, and reminded Edith powerfully of herself at that age, which made her both fond and protective. She talked to Margaret the way her father had talked to her, as if ideas were important and women were as capable of having them as anyone else, which in 1882 in Kansas was not a universally held position, but which Edith held with conviction and acted on accordingly. She thought sometimes about what the territory had taken from women. She had seen it up close, in Clara's weathered face and in the stories of other women in the county, the ones who had come with hope and been worn down by isolation and relentless labor, the ones whose inner lives had been gradually buried under the enormous weight of survival. The injustice of it was real, and she did not pretend otherwise, even when acknowledging it was uncomfortable. Women had built this place as surely as men had built it with more limited resources and fewer legal protections and almost no credit for the building. And that was a fact that sat in Edith with a permanent, low-grade anger she channeled into the library and into Margaret Dale, and into the conversations she had with the women who came in. The land itself was not unjust. The land was simply land, enormous and demanding, and occasionally beautiful in ways that stopped the breath. It was the structures built on top of the land, the human arrangements, where the injustice lived. Edith worked within those arrangements to make what room she could, for herself and for other women, and she was not naive about how small that room was, but she was stubborn, which was possibly her greatest fault or her greatest gift depending on who you asked. Joel understood this about her and did not diminish it. He was, in the language of his time and place, an unusual man in this respect. He had looked at the arrangements and found them more or less unreasonable without being told to find them so. He said once over supper that it seemed to him that the people doing the most work were frequently the people with the least say, and Edith had looked at him and asked if he was talking about farmers in general or women in particular, and he had said, "Both. It seems related." She had put her hand over his on the table and said, "You are unexpectedly progressive." "I'm practical," he said. "Waste is waste. You don't leave the best acreage unplanted because you've always used the other field." It was the most agricultural metaphor she had ever heard applied to gender equity, and she treasured it. In the summer of 1882, they had a visitor that was not Ruth. A man arrived at the farm one August morning on a dun horse with a worn saddle and a letter in his pocket addressed to Joel, and he turned out to be Joel's brother Thomas, who had written from Colorado that he might be coming through but had been characteristically vague about timing, which apparently ran in the Bishop family. Thomas Bishop was 32, lean and sun-darkened, with the same gray-green eyes as Joel but a more restless quality to them, and he was charming in the particular way of men who have learned to be charming because it is useful, which is to say superficially charming, which Edith noticed immediately and decided not to comment on. He was kind to Henry, genuinely so, sitting on the floor and building block towers with the seriousness that small children require of adults engaged in their projects, and that recovered him somewhat in Edith's estimate. He stayed for 2 weeks, sleeping in the guest room that had been put together for Ruth's visits, and in that time he and Joel had long conversations over the evening's remaining coffee about the situation in Colorado and what Thomas was planning next, which Thomas was characteristically vague about. Edith gathered that Thomas had been involved in several ventures over the preceding years, some legitimate and some not entirely, and that he was now in a transitional period of the sort that requires a brother's farm and a brother's good cooking to navigate. She did not dislike him. She found him interesting in the way of people who are not yet entirely what they are going to be. She fed him well and talked with him freely and made it clear, through the ordinary medium of conduct rather than statement, that this was a household with particular standards of honesty and straightforwardness, and that visitors were expected to meet those standards, and Thomas, who was perceptive enough to read the room accurately, rose to meet them. On his last evening he sat on the porch with Edith while Joel was putting Henry to bed, and he said, looking out at the north field in the August dusk, "That's a good garden." "It's his great project," Edith said. "It started as a winter garden and now it's year-round." "He planted it when you told him you were leaving," Thomas said. She looked at him. "He wrote me a letter," Thomas said, not apologetically. "In November of last year, I'm his brother, he told me." He paused. "He also told me you stayed." "I stayed," she confirmed. "He said in the letter," Thomas paused, choosing. "He said he didn't know any other way to say it, so he said it in seeds." He shook his head slowly, not quite smiling. "Joel was always like that. When our father wouldn't listen to anything he said, he'd just go and do the thing himself and let the doing speak." He looked at her sideways. "I'm glad it worked." "So am I," Edith said. "You're good for him," Thomas said. "You make him say things out loud." "He's getting better at it," she said. "I noticed," Thomas said. "Tonight at supper he said 3 things that I would have bet money he'd never say out loud. About the baby, about you." He paused. "He looks at you the way a person looks at the thing they were most afraid of losing." Edith was quiet for a moment. "Go and see something you like in Colorado, Thomas," she said. "Then come back and plant yourself somewhere and grow." He looked at her. "You're like Ruth," he said. "You say the real thing without decorating it." "I learned late," she said. "Don't take as long as I did." Thomas left in the morning and rode north, and Edith watched him go from the porch and thought about the various forms of stubbornness, and the various directions it could take a person, toward or away from the things that mattered, and thought, not for the first time, that the bravest choice she had ever made had been the one she had not fully understood she was making at the time. The second winter garden went in that October with Henry standing in the turned earth at 14 months, steadied by his father's hand, watching the seeds go down with great solemnity. By the October after that, Henry was 2.5, and he had his own small trowel, and he planted things with the assistance of his father with extraordinary seriousness, pushing bulbs into holes that were entirely the wrong depth, but with such earnest care that neither parent said a word about depth, and simply waited to see what happened. What happened was that the garlic came up crooked and enthusiastic in the spring, and Henry was enormously pleased with himself, and Edith pressed the moment into her memory with the deliberate care of a woman who has learned to recognize the moments that matter while she's in them rather than only in retrospect. By the spring of 1883, Edith was expecting again. This was discovered in February, which meant the arrival would be August or September, and she told Joel on a February evening with the snow on the ground and the fire in the hearth and Henry asleep in the back room, and Joel's response was to pull her into an embrace so immediate and wholehearted that she laughed into his shoulder. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. "Henry will be 3, he said, already calculating, always practically minded even in his happiness. He'll be a wonderful older brother, she said. He's already bossing the chickens. He gets that from your side, Joel said. She pulled back to look at him with great dignity. My family does not boss chickens. Your sister bossed my chickens within 15 minutes of arrival, he said. This was, Edith had to concede, technically accurate. Ruth had taken a position on the organization of the henhouse and had communicated it without delay. She had also been right, which Edith did not mention. They were still laughing when they went to bed. Nora Bishop arrived in late August of 1883, small and certain of herself from the first hour, with Joel's gray-green eyes already clearly in evidence, and a pair of lungs that had nothing modest about them. Ruth arrived 6 days after Nora's birth. She had come as soon as the letter reached St. Louis, and stood at the foot of the bed holding the baby with an expression of profound satisfaction. She's remarkable, Ruth said. She is rather loud, Edith said. That's energy, Ruth said firmly. That's character. Henry, introduced to his sister that afternoon, regarded her with his father's careful gravity for a long moment, then said, She is very small, and then went back to his blocks, satisfied that the situation had been assessed. Joel sat on the edge of the bed beside Edith and looked at his daughter, and the expression was the same one from Henry's arrival, wide and full and without words. Nora, he said. Nora, Edith agreed. It had been her grandmother's name, a woman who had emigrated from Ireland with nothing and built something in Ohio and had been, by all accounts, as stubborn as rock and as warm as good bread. It suited. The children grew as children do in those years on the frontier, rapidly, substantially, with a self-sufficiency that was partly necessity and partly temperament. Henry was thoughtful and patient, and was already at 4, a person Joel could take to the garden and work alongside in genuine partnership, each of them doing their portion of a task with quiet concentration. Nora was fast and loud, and possessed of strong opinions that she communicated without ambiguity, and she could be found at 18 months following the chickens around the yard with a stick and a theory. Edith watched her children and thought about the lives they would have and worked, with intention and constancy, to make those lives larger than constraint. She brought Henry to the library as soon as he was old enough to sit still for a story, which was earlier than expected. She made sure Nora heard the same stories and received the same expectations, because a world that told girls they were less capable than boys was a world she had no intention of perpetuating in her own household. The library had, by 1884, become a genuine community institution. It had a small board, Edith, Clara Briggs, the minister's wife Mrs. Hartley, and Tom Dillard, who had become an unlikely but committed champion, and it had received a modest donation from a ranching family in the county who had been persuaded by Edith's letter writing that a library was a sound investment in their neighbors' capacities. It had 240 volumes and a growing collection of periodicals and a reading group that met on Thursdays that had, at its most recent meeting, an attendance of 11 women and 2 men, one of whom was Joel. Joel had begun attending the reading group in the spring, quietly, without announcement, showing up one Thursday with his hat in his hand, and finding a seat and contributing, when he contributed, with economy and precision. The other attendees regarded him with varying degrees of surprise, which he bore without comment. After the third meeting, Mrs. Hartley told Edith that Mr. Bishop was a valuable addition. After the 5th meeting, a ranch hand named Corwin Price, who had been coming for 2 weeks, said to Joel that he hadn't expected a farmer to have read so much, and Joel said, equably, that a man had to do something in January. Edith overheard this exchange and spent the better part of the walk home containing her satisfaction. In the fall of 1884, 5 years after the morning she had stood on the porch and said the words that had changed everything, Edith stood in the north field in the October cold while Joel worked beside her, turning the ground for the winter plantings, and she thought about time and about how it accumulates. How a life is made in the accumulation of days that at the time seem ordinary and in retrospect reveal themselves as anything but. Henry was 3.5 and doing his serious business planting. Nora, who had just learned to walk entirely on her own, was moving between them with the dogged determination of a person who has discovered her own locomotion and intends to make maximum use of it. The sky was the purple-bruised color of an October Kansas evening, and the air smelled of cold earth, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be, in the clearest and most certain sense she had ever experienced. Joel paused beside her. "You're looking at the sky," he said. "I'm looking at the sky," she agreed. "It's very large." "It is," he said. "It used to frighten me," she said. "The size of it." He waited, leaning on his shovel. "It doesn't anymore," she said. "I don't know exactly when that changed." She thought about it. "Maybe when I stopped thinking it was trying to diminish me and started thinking it was just sky, just what it is." He nodded, the slow nod of a man who has thought similar thoughts in his own way. "The first time I came out here," he said, and she knew he meant Kansas, the West, this life. "I was 17, scared as hell. The sky did the same thing to me." He paused. "But I had nothing to go back to that was better. So I just stayed in it long enough to stop being scared." "You could have told me that," she said. "I could have," he said. "I should have, I thought." He stopped. Started again, because this was what he did now, started again rather than letting the silence swallow the sentence. "I thought you'd find your way to it on your own, the way I did. I forgot that you had something to go back to that was better." She looked at him. "No," she said, "not better, familiar." He met her eyes. "Different thing," she said. "Different thing," he agreed. Henry came and pressed himself against her leg, and she put her hand on his hair, and Nora arrived on her determined short legs and took hold of her father's trouser leg and said with great urgency, "Duh, bird." "Where?" Joel said with complete seriousness. Nora pointed at nothing in particular, which was either a bird or a leaf or a thought. "Bird," she said again, satisfied. "Good eye," Joel said, and she beamed. Edith stood in the north field with the October cold and her family around her, and the turned earth smelling of minerals and the coming winter and the certain promise, under everything, of spring. That evening after the children were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and the lamp, going through the accounts for the quarter, and Joel sat across from her with a seed catalog and a cup of coffee, and they were quiet together in the good way, the way that was not absence but presence, the silence of two people who have said the things that needed saying and are now simply here. After a while she put down her pen and looked at him. "Joel," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for the garden. The first one." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking about how to say the thing, because he was better at it now, practiced, though it still required intention. "Thank you for staying long enough to see it," he said. She reached across the table, and he met her hand with his, those calloused certain hands, and they stayed like that in the lamplight with the Kansas night outside, and the seed catalog between them and the children asleep in the back rooms, and the north field waiting in the dark to be planted again in the morning. It was not the life she had planned. It was not the life she had expected or imagined at 23 in Cincinnati or at 26 on the porch with her words already forming. It was a life that had grown sideways, through practical necessity, without ceremony, in the direction of something real. There were still mornings when the sky felt large. There were still days when the wind came out of the north without mercy, and the isolation had weight. She did not pretend otherwise, because she had stopped pretending that the difficulty was a personal failure rather than simply the character of the place. But there were also the parsnips in February, sweeter for the cold. There were the kale leaves dark and deep in the frost-white field. There was the garlic in the ground all winter, invisible and patient, becoming what it was going to be in its own time and in its own way, ready in the spring. There was a man across the table who had heard her say she was leaving and had gone to get a shovel and had said, in the only language fully available to him, "I am still here. I will tend this. I will be here when you are." There were 2 children asleep in the back rooms who were going to inherit this land and this sky and this stubborn, patient love, and who were going to be told. Edith was already certain of this, had been certain since Henry first pressed his hands into the turned earth, the story of the winter garden and what it meant. She was 26 when she stood on the porch with the words already out. She was 31 now, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight in the October dark, with 5 years of accumulated days between those 2 moments, and the accumulation was everything. The parsnip soup and the reading group Thursdays, and the letter she had written to Ruth, and the one that had said I am staying, and the morning the garlic came up in April, and the way Joel's face had looked when the doctor had said everything was fine, and the way Henry looked at the garden with the seriousness of someone who understands that growing things require gravity. The lamplight moved in the draft from the window and Joel turned a page of the seed catalog, and outside the first frost of this new season was settling quiet and cold over the north field, the same as it always had, the same as it always would, and everything under it was already working toward spring. It had always been toward spring. That was what he had known, that October, with his shovel and his seeds. That was what he had said in the only language he had, that the cold was not the end of the thing, that the frost was not the last word. That something put into the ground in the hard season, with care, with intention, with the full knowledge that it will not be visible for a long time, is not a wasted thing. It is the most optimistic thing a person can do. She had understood that eventually. She understood it now completely, sitting across from him in the lamplight. She said, "What are you thinking about planting this year, in the winter plot?" He looked up from the catalog, and his face in the warm light was familiar in the way of something you cannot imagine having not known, the way you cannot remember the shape of a room before a particular piece of furniture was placed in it. "I found a variety of spinach that's supposed to do well in hard cold," he said, "and I want to try a different kind of garlic, hardneck, supposed to have more flavor." "Then we try the hardneck," she said. He smiled, the full-face smile, and reached for his coffee. "In the morning," he said. "In the morning," she agreed, and picked up her pen, and they sat together in the good quiet until the lamp burned low, and the night pressed warm and close around them, and the frost settled soft and patient on the waiting ground outside, as it always had, as it always would, until the world turned and everything came up, inevitable and necessary, into the light.